Welcome to Echoes of the Past interviews. I'm Serafina Moreau, and joining me in studio are my three co-hosts. Hello to you all, and thanks for being here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Evelyn Hayes, looking forward to today's conversation. It promises to be a lively one.
Hello to my co-hosts and everyone tuned in. I'm Julian Thorne. Always a pleasure to dive into the echoes of history.
And I am Dr. Alistair Finch. A warm welcome to our listeners. This one, well, it's bound to stir some reflection.
Indeed. Before we get to today's guest, I have to ask, Julian, Alistair, when you hear the name Cecil Rhodes, what comes to mind?
Honestly, a man of contradictions. Visionary to some, villain to others. He's like a mirror. People see what they want to see. And I expect today's interview will reveal even more layers.
Yes, he's a figure one can't approach without nuance. There's legacy, ambition, and no shortage of controversy. But I'm especially interested in what he believes about what he did, not just what history says about him.
That's the beauty of these conversations, isn't it? They allow us to get beneath the surface, to ask the questions history books often skip. Here at Echoes of the Past interviews, we travel back in time to speak with some of the most influential figures of our known history. My co-hosts and I each bring a distinct lens to the table, so we're certain that you, our listeners, will find today's interview, if not entertaining, then certainly educational. Dr. Hayes, would you mind telling us a bit about today's guest?
Thank you. Well, our guest today is one of the most influential and polarizing figures in British imperial history. Mr. Cecil John Rhodes was born in 1853 in England. Rhodes arrived in southern Africa as a teenager, initially seeking better health and opportunity. But he quickly became a towering force in both business and politics. By the age of 37, he had founded the De Beers Diamond Company, securing near total control over the global diamond trade. But diamonds were just the beginning. Driven by a vision of British expansion, Rhodes served as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and orchestrated the establishment of what would become Rhodesia, named after himself, and now known as Zimbabwe and Zambia. He was a fervent believer in empire, famously dreaming of a British-dominated Africa from Cape to Cairo. Yet his legacy is deeply contested. Admired by some for his ambition and philanthropy, including founding the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, he is equally criticized for his role in colonial exploitation, racial segregation, and dispossession of African peoples. Today, we're not just meeting a man of his time, we're confronting the ambitions, contradictions, and consequences that continue to echo long after his death in 1902.
Thank you for that, Dr. Hayes. And now, listeners, it's time to step back into the late 19th century and hear from the man himself. Empire builder, industrialist, politician, a figure whose name still sparks debate in classrooms, courtrooms, and across continents. Joining us today, across time and history, is none other than Mr. Cecil John Rhodes. Mr. Rhodes, welcome to the program. We're honored, and perhaps a little intrigued, to have you with us.
The pleasure is mine, Miss Moreau. I must say it is rather novel being summoned across the decades for a conversation. But if there's one thing I've never shied from, it's a platform to share my views.
Well, we certainly appreciate your willingness to engage, especially given the scope and complexity of your legacy. Let's dive in then. I'll begin with a question that sets the stage. Mr. Rhodes, many know of your immense ambition, but few perhaps understand its earliest seeds. Can you take us back to your arrival in Natal, a sickly young man? What was a specific, perhaps even private, dream or vision you held then that fueled your initial drive? Something beyond just recovering your health.
Right. Natal. I arrived there in 1870, a young man of 17, not in the best of health, as you rightly point out. The doctors in England had given me a rather grim prognosis, suggesting the warmer climate of Africa might offer some respite. My brother Herbert was already there, trying his hand at cotton farming. Beyond the immediate concern for my lungs, which frankly was a rather potent motivator in itself, there was already a stirring within me, a nascent vision, if you will. It wasn't perhaps as sharply defined as it would later become, but the seeds were there. I looked around Natal and then later, more profoundly, at the diamond fields of Kimberley, where I soon ventured. I saw vast, undeveloped lands, immense natural wealth, and a conspicuous lack of what I considered organized British influence and enterprise on a grand scale. Even then, as a young man trying to establish himself, the thought wasn't merely about personal enrichment, though that was certainly a means to an end. The private dream, the one that began to take shape in those early days, was the vision of British dominion expanding, not just as a colonial power, but as a civilizing force, bringing infrastructure, order, and what I believed to be progress across the African continent. I dreamt of a continuous swathe of British territory, connected, developed, and prosperous under the Union Jack. It was a grand, almost audacious idea for a young man still finding his feet, but the sheer potential of the land and the perceived vacuum of strong, unified British leadership fueled that ambition intensely. I recall standing on the koppies, looking out over the dusty plains, and not just seeing the chaos of the diamond rush, but imagining what could be. I envisioned railways cutting through the landscape, connecting disparate regions, new towns and cities rising, and an overarching British administration ensuring stability and fostering development according to British ideals. It was this larger picture, this notion of shaping a continent and extending British influence for what I genuinely believed was the betterment of all, that truly ignited my drive beyond the mere necessity of survival or the simple accumulation of wealth. The diamonds, the gold, the land, these were the tools, the raw materials to build something far greater and more enduring. That was the kernel of the idea that would grow into my life's work.
You amassed unimaginable wealth, Mr. Rhodes. There's a story that you once laid out diamonds on a table for a visitor and asked, "What are these? Stones, that's all." Was there a deeper, perhaps even an emotional disconnect for you between the material wealth and what it truly represented or allowed you to achieve?
Ah, that story, or variations of it, has certainly done the rounds. And yes, the sentiment is entirely accurate. Diamonds, gold, they are indeed just stones, just metal. In their raw, inert state, they hold little intrinsic interest for me beyond their market value. The disconnect, as you term it, wasn't so much emotional as it was practical, a matter of perspective. Imagine a craftsman. Does he become emotionally attached to each individual nail or plank of wood? No, his focus, his passion, is on the structure he intends to build, the house, the bridge, the grand edifice. For me, wealth, the diamonds, the gold and shares, was precisely that, the raw material, the capital, the power to bring grander visions into being. They were the means, not the end. Their value lay not in their sparkle or their weight in a vault, but in what they could do. What could they do? They could finance the acquisition of vast territories for the Crown. They could build railways and telegraph lines that would stretch from the Cape to Cairo, knitting together a continent under British influence. They could fund expeditions, support governance, and yes, ultimately endow the scholarships designed to cultivate future leaders who, I hoped, would see the world and their duty within it in a similar light. So, if there was an emotional connection, it was not to the diamonds themselves. The emotion, the drive, the passion, the unwavering conviction was tied to the realization of those imperial ambitions, to the expansion of British civilization, to the creation of a world order as I envisioned it. The stones were simply the fuel for that engine. Piling them on a table and calling them stones was a way of expressing that ultimate purpose, of stripping away the mystique of wealth to reveal its true utility in the pursuit of greater, more enduring objectives. It was a statement of priorities. The real treasure was the empire, the influence, the legacy of a transformed Africa. The diamonds were merely a very effective key to unlock that.
Mr. Rhodes, your famous statement, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Let's be blunt. How did you reconcile this view with the intellect and established societies of, say, the Matabele or the Mashona, peoples whose lands you aggressively pursued?
That is a direct question, and one that demands a direct answer. My statement, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race," was a profound conviction. It was a belief rooted in the context of the late 19th century, an era of immense industrial, scientific, and imperial expansion by nations like Britain. When I spoke of the first race, I was referring to what I perceived as the achievements, the drive, the capacity for governance, and the development of societal structures that, in my view, placed the English-speaking peoples, particularly the British, at the vanguard of global progress. Now, how did I reconcile this with peoples like the Matabele or the Mashona? I recognized that these were established societies with their own hierarchies, traditions, and systems of rule. I spent considerable time in southern Africa. I observed them. I negotiated, sometimes contentiously, with figures like Lobengula of the Matabele. He was a king with his own court and his own power, and to suggest otherwise would be foolish. However, my perspective, and that of many of my contemporaries, was that these societies, however organized internally, had not, in our view, harnessed the material resources of their lands to the extent we believed possible, nor had they developed the type of overarching political and economic systems that we associated with civilization and progress on a global scale. We saw tribal conflicts, what we considered to be inefficient land use, and a lack of the infrastructure, the railways, the telegraphs, the large-scale industries that we saw as hallmarks of an advanced society capable of uplifting the human condition more broadly. The reconciliation, in my mind, was this. I believed that the extension of British governance, infrastructure, and economic models would ultimately bring benefits to these lands and their inhabitants, even if it meant disrupting or supplanting existing structures. I saw it as bringing order where, from my perspective, there was often strife, bringing development where there was, in my view, stagnation, and connecting these regions to a global network of trade and ideas, thereby, in my estimation, improving their lot in the long run. It was not a denial of their intellect or their existing societal structures, but rather a conviction that our model of civilization, our race's capacity for large-scale organization and development, offered a superior path to what I genuinely considered to be the betterment of the human race as a whole. The pursuit of land was aggressive, yes, because the vision was grand, and the conviction was that this expansion was a necessary step in that larger project of global improvement under British leadership. It was a belief that the first race had a unique capacity, and therefore a responsibility, to shape the world for what I considered to be its ultimate benefit.
The Rudd Concession, pivotal for acquiring mineral rights in Matabele land. It's documented that Lobengula later disavowed it, claiming he was misled about its implications, particularly regarding land rights versus just digging for minerals. From your perspective, what were the actual terms presented to him by your envoys, and was there any intentional ambiguity to secure the agreement?
The Rudd concession, a most critical juncture, as you say. Let us be clear about my objectives and how I instructed my agents, Mr. Rudd, Mr. Thompson, and Mr. Maguire. The goal was to secure exclusive mineral rights throughout Matabeleland and its surrounding territories. This was essential for the broader vision of British expansion and development in the region. I was well aware that Lobengula was being approached by various parties seeking concessions, and it was imperative that we secured a comprehensive and exclusive agreement. The terms presented to Lobengula, as I understood them and as they were intended, were for the complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals situated in his kingdoms, principalities, and dominions. This included the authority to exclude all other persons seeking land, metals, minerals, or mining rights. In return, a payment of £100 was to be made on the first day of every lunar month, and we were to deliver 1,000 Martini Henry breech-loading rifles along with 100,000 rounds of ammunition. There was also the offer of a steamboat on the Zambezi River, or, if Lobengula preferred, the sum of £500. Now, regarding the claims that Lobengula was misled, particularly about land rights versus merely digging for minerals, it is true that the king later sought to repudiate the concession, stating he had not intended to grant such sweeping powers, and that he believed the agreement pertained only to the digging of a few holes. He and some of his indunas, councillors, argued that verbal assurances were given by my representatives that limited the scope of our activities. For instance, that we would not bring many white men, that they would abide by his laws, and would not dig near towns. From my perspective, the written terms of the concession, which were translated to Lobengula, reportedly by Reverend Charles Helm, whom Lobengula trusted, were clear. The document grants complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals, and the full authority to do all things that they may deem necessary to win and procure the same. This, in my view, and in the language of such concessions of the era, implicitly included the necessary access to and use of land required to extract those minerals. One cannot, after all, extract minerals from the earth without disturbing the land itself. Now, to your pointed question about intentional ambiguity. It was certainly my intention to secure the most comprehensive rights possible. My envoys were tasked with achieving this. In any negotiation, particularly one of such consequence and across cultural and linguistic divides, there can be differing interpretations. Lobengula was a shrewd leader, dealing with immense pressure and numerous petitioners. His understanding would have been shaped by the verbal explanations and discussions as much as by the translated text. While I would not say there was a deliberate intent to deceive him in the crudest sense, as in telling him one thing while the paper said another, there was undoubtedly an intent to frame the agreement in such a way that it would serve the expansive purposes of the British South Africa Company. We were operating in a competitive environment. The language of the concession was legalistic and broad, designed to give us the maximum latitude. If Lobengula and his councillors later felt the full implications of exclusive charge and the right to do all things necessary went beyond their initial understanding of simply digging a hole, that is perhaps a reflection of the inherent complexities and power dynamics at play. It is also possible that my representatives, in their eagerness to secure the deal, may have emphasized the benefits and downplayed the more extensive encroachments that the concession would permit. The reality of such colonial negotiations is that the party with the clearer long-term strategic vision and the greater resources often shapes the outcome and the interpretation of agreements. My interest was in securing the means for British expansion. The Rudd concession, as written, provided that. Whether Lobengula fully grasped or was allowed to fully grasp every potential future consequence of those written words is a matter that historians, and indeed his own protestations, have continued to debate. But from my standpoint, the written word was what was agreed to, and it was upon that basis that we proceeded.
You had a complex relationship with the Afrikaner Bond in the Cape Colony, initially cultivating their support. What was a specific, lesser-known compromise or concession you made to secure their alliance in your early political career that perhaps sat uncomfortably with your broader imperial ambitions?
That's a perceptive question. My relationship with Jan Hofmeyr and the Afrikaner Bond was indeed one of pragmatic necessity, particularly in the early stages of my political career in the Cape Colony. To govern, and more importantly, to secure the support needed for my ambitions further north, their backing was indispensable. One specific compromise, perhaps less heralded than broader agreements on language or native policy, concerned the substantial financial aid and legislative focus dedicated to combating the phylloxera outbreak in the Cape Vineyards during the 1880s and into the 1890s. Now, you might say, Mr. Rhodes, supporting a key colonial industry is hardly a compromise. And in principle, you'd be correct. A prosperous Cape was a stronger base for imperial expansion. However, the wine farmers were the bedrock of the Afrikaner Bond's political power. The devastation caused by phylloxera threatened their livelihoods and, by extension, the Bond's influence, and therefore my own political stability and ability to pursue my northern agenda. The uncomfortable aspect, for a man whose gaze was fixed on annexing territories thousands of miles away and developing vast mineral wealth, was the sheer amount of colonial treasure and, critically, parliamentary time and energy that had to be diverted to this specific agricultural crisis. We are talking about significant government loans, extensive subsidies for the importation and grafting of American rootstock, and debates over related tariff protections and excise duties on brandy, which was the lifeblood of many of these farmers. While I publicly championed these relief efforts as necessary for the colony's well-being, privately, the intense focus on saving the vineyards, driven by the Bond's political clout, could feel like a frustrating diversion from the grander imperial chess game I was attempting to play. Every pound sterling spent, every hour of debate in the Cape Parliament dedicated to the microscopic louse devastating the vines, felt like resources and attention pulled away from the telegraph lines, the railways, and the administrative structures I was so eager to push northwards. It was a politically essential compromise. I had to ensure the Bond remained my ally, and that meant addressing their existential concerns with vigor. But yes, there were moments when championing the intricate details of viticultural rescue, while vital for my partners, sat a little uncomfortably with the impatient, continental scale of my personal ambitions. It was a necessary concession to the realities of Cape politics to fuel the engine of imperial expansion.
You never married, and your closest personal relationships, like with Neville Pickering or Leander Starr Jameson, were intense male friendships. Did your relentless drive for empire leave little room for traditional romantic partnership, or was there a deeper personal reason for remaining a bachelor throughout your life?
That is a rather personal turn, but a question that has been posed before, often with a great deal of insinuation. It is true that I never married. My life was, from a relatively young age, consumed by a singular, all-encompassing purpose: the expansion of British influence and the establishment of a vast, interconnected British domain in Africa and indeed beyond. This was not a pursuit that easily accommodated the traditional demands of marriage and family life as understood in my era. Think of the sheer scale of the enterprise. The constant travel, the negotiations, the political maneuvering, the financial intricacies, the planning of expeditions and infrastructure. It was a jealous mistress, this empire building. It demanded my entire focus, my unwavering attention, and frankly, nearly all of my waking hours. A wife, a family, would have required a division of that focus, a commitment of time and emotional energy that I felt I could not spare if I were to achieve the monumental goals I had set for myself and for Britain. My relationships with men like Neville Pickering, whose early death was a profound personal blow, and, of course, Leander Starr Jameson, were indeed intense. These were men who shared my vision, who understood the scale of the ambition, and who were prepared to dedicate their lives alongside mine to its realization. They were comrades in arms, confidants in a grand and often perilous undertaking. In the rugged, demanding environments in which we often found ourselves, far from the settled comforts of England, such bonds of loyalty and shared purpose naturally became exceptionally strong. These were partnerships in ambition and action. Was there a deeper personal reason beyond this? People have speculated, and will continue to do so, about the nature of my affections and the reasons for my bachelorhood. Let them. My private life, beyond its intersection with my public work, was largely my own. However, to address your query directly, my primary devotion was to my work, to the empire. It was an all-consuming passion that left little space for the kind of domestic life that marriage traditionally entailed. I found my companionship, my intellectual sparring partners, and my most trusted allies among the men who shared my imperial vision and labored alongside me. These relationships were foundational to my ability to pursue my ambitions. Whether this focus precluded romantic inclinations entirely, or whether my nature was simply not inclined towards traditional marriage, is a matter I did not often dwell on publicly, nor do I intend to dissect it exhaustively now. My energies were channeled elsewhere. The building of nations, the painting of the map red, these were the legacies I sought to leave. A wife and children, in my calculus, would have been a distraction from, rather than an addition to, that singular overarching purpose. Perhaps it was a sacrifice, if you wish to call it that, but every man makes choices about where to invest his life's energies. Mine were invested in the vast landscapes of Africa and the idea of a British world. That, for me, was fulfillment enough.
It's documented that you sometimes employed methods that some might call bribery or undue influence to achieve your political and business aims, such as payments to sway figures in the Cape Parliament or in London. Did you view these as necessary evils or simply pragmatic tools of statecraft and business in your era?
That is a rather direct way of phrasing it, but I understand the implication. Let us speak plainly. In the pursuit of objectives as vast as those I set myself, the consolidation of territories, the building of railways, the securing of mineral rights, the shaping of colonial policy, one encounters many obstacles. Some are physical, some are political, and many involve the competing interests and ambitions of other men. Did I use the financial resources at my disposal to garner support, to expedite processes, or to persuade individuals to see things from a perspective that aligned with my larger vision? Yes, I did. In the Cape Parliament, in London, and elsewhere, influence was, and I dare say still is, a currency. Men have their price, whether it is for their vote, their voice, or their inaction. To achieve ends that I firmly believed were not merely for my personal enrichment, but for the advancement of the British Empire and the development of new territories, I was prepared to employ the means necessary. Would I call them necessary evils? Perhaps evil is too strong a word, implying a moral failing. I viewed them as pragmatic tools of statecraft and business, particularly in an era where the lines were perhaps more blurred than they are today. If a payment could secure a vital concession that would open up a territory for development and British administration, or if it could ensure the passage of legislation beneficial to the growth of the colony and the empire, then it was a practical step. My detractors would call it bribery. I would call it securing alignment of interests. My aim was always the larger picture, the expansion of the first race, the bringing of what I considered civilization and progress. The men I dealt with often had more parochial or personal concerns. If financial considerations could bring their interests into harmony with my own broader imperial objectives, then I saw it as an efficient use of resources. Every statesman, every empire builder throughout history has had to navigate the complexities of human nature and political reality. Pure idealism rarely achieves tangible results on the scale I envisioned. One must be prepared to engage with the world as it is, not merely as one wishes it to be. My conscience was clear in that the ultimate aims were, in my conviction, for a greater good. The methods employed were those I deemed necessary and effective to achieve those monumental ends.
Your Bill for Africa philosophy, the idea that expansion northwards was essential for the Cape's economic future. Beyond the grand imperial rhetoric, what was a specific, hard-nosed economic projection or resource expectation, perhaps one that didn't pan out, that underpinned this drive for northward expansion that isn't widely discussed?
You're digging deeper now, beyond the usual refrains. Good. The Bill for Africa was indeed posited on the understanding that the Cape Colony, to truly prosper and not just be a way station, needed a vast economic hinterland. While imperial sentiment and the map painting had their undeniable appeal, the underlying engine, the one that would persuade cautious investors in London and practical men in the Cape Parliament, had to be economic. Beyond the general allure of untapped resources, a very specific, hard-nosed expectation, one that was perhaps spoken of more fervently in the boardrooms of the British South Africa Company than in public political speeches, was the belief in the existence of a second Rand in Mashonaland and Matabeleland. The discovery and explosive development of the Witwatersrand goldfields from 1886 had fundamentally transformed the economic landscape of southern Africa. It created unprecedented wealth, drove railway construction, and attracted massive investment and population. My entire venture with the British South Africa Company, the push to acquire the charter and the subsequent occupation of Mashonaland, was heavily predicated on the conviction, fueled by ancient workings, reports from explorers like Karl Mauch, and a good dose of optimistic speculation, that similarly vast, if not greater, gold deposits lay north of the Limpopo. The economic projection was straightforward, if ultimately overly optimistic. 1. Vast gold output. We anticipated finding goldfields that would rival or even surpass the Rand. This wasn't just a vague hope, it was factored into the potential profitability and share value of the company. 2. Self-funding territory. The revenue from this second Rand would, it was projected, swiftly pay for the administration of the new territories, the construction of railways and telegraphs connecting them to the Cape, and handsome dividends for our shareholders. It would make the northward expansion self-sustaining, not a drain on the Cape or imperial coffers. 3. Economic boom for the Cape. A massive gold rush north of the Limpopo would create an enormous new market for Cape agricultural produce, manufactured goods, and financial services. It would stimulate the Cape's economy just as the Rand was stimulating the Transvaals, but this time under British control and directly benefiting the Cape. This expectation of a second Rand was the immediate, powerful economic driver. It was the promise that loosened purse strings and justified the immense logistical and political efforts. Now, did it pan out as spectacularly as the Witwatersrand? No, it did not. Gold was certainly found in Rhodesia, significant amounts in fact, which sustained the colony for many years. But it was more dispersed in quartz reefs rather than the consistent banket reefs of the Rand, requiring different, often more capital-intensive methods of extraction. There was no single, massive, easily exploitable concentration comparable to Johannesburg's goldfields that emerged in those early years. This discrepancy between the initial fervent economic projection of another Witwatersrand and the more modest, albeit still valuable, Rhodesian gold was a significant challenge. It meant the company had to look to other sources of revenue more quickly: land sales, hut taxes, and encouraging varied forms of agriculture and mining other minerals, and that the dream of an instantly self-funding El Dorado took longer and was more complex to realize than the most optimistic early prospectuses suggested. That was the less discussed, hard-nosed economic gamble underpinning much of the initial drive north.
It's said that during the siege of Kimberley, you insisted on your cook preparing elaborate meals, sometimes under shellfire, to maintain morale and a sense of normalcy. Can you share a specific, perhaps lesser-known anecdote from that siege that highlights your particular approach to leadership under extreme pressure?
Ah, the Siege of Kimberley, a trying time indeed. October 1899 to February 1900. 4 months of being hemmed in by the Boers, with shells for breakfast conversation. You are right, I did insist on a certain standard of living, including at my table at the sanatorium where I resided. It was not about personal indulgence so much as a deliberate act of maintaining morale, a symbol that we would not be reduced to a state of barbarity by the enemy's actions. A well-laid table, a properly served meal, these things represented order and civilization, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. But beyond the dining table, an anecdote that perhaps illustrates my particular approach to leadership under that extreme pressure relates to the establishment and maintenance of extensive vegetable gardens under considerable duress. As the siege dragged on, fresh provisions naturally became exceedingly scarce. Scurvy was a genuine threat to both the civilian population and the garrison. While the military did what it could with rationing, I saw both a critical need and an opportunity. I directed De Beers to commit significant resources, manpower, valuable water, and expertise from our company gardeners to cultivate fresh vegetables on any suitable piece of land we could find within the town's perimeter. This included areas that were, shall we say, not entirely out of range of Boer artillery. I remember making it a point to visit these gardens regularly, even when the shells were flying. It wasn't just to inspect the progress of the cabbages and carrots. It was to visibly demonstrate that we were not merely passively awaiting relief. We were actively working to sustain ourselves, to innovate, and to maintain a sense of productive normalcy. Seeing things grow, seeing organized activity aimed at the community's welfare, had a powerful psychological effect. It was an act of defiance, a testament to our resolve to not only survive, but to continue to build and provide, even under siege. There were those, including at times elements of the military command, that were understandably focused solely on defensive measures, who perhaps saw this as a secondary concern or an inefficient use of manpower that could be digging trenches. But to my mind, sustaining the health and morale of the thousands cooped up in Kimberley was as vital as any military fortification. It demonstrated foresight and a commitment to the people's well-being, which I believed was a cornerstone of leadership. It was about looking beyond the immediate crisis to the continued viability of the community. We were not just defending a piece of land, we were preserving a society. And societies need more than just bullets and bully beef to survive. They need sustenance, hope, and the visible evidence of order and care. The gardens provided all of that in a very tangible way.
You suffered from a significant heart condition from a young age. How did the constant awareness of your own mortality, the knowledge that your time might be limited, shape your urgency, your ambition, and perhaps even your willingness to take monumental risks?
That is a very astute observation, and one that cuts close to the bone. From my youth, I was acutely aware that my constitution was not robust. The doctors gave me but a short time in England, dispatching me to Africa for the sake of my lungs as a mere lad. And then there was the heart, always a lurking presence, a reminder that the clock was ticking, perhaps faster for me than for others. How did this shape me? Profoundly. Firstly, it instilled in me a profound sense of urgency. There was no time for dithering, for half measures, or for the slow, methodical plodding that might satisfy a man convinced he had a full 70 years and 10 ahead of him. I felt I had to achieve in decades what others might take a lifetime to contemplate. Every day counted. This urgency translated directly into the pace at which I sought to move, to acquire, to build. If a plan was good, it was best enacted now. Secondly, it undoubtedly magnified my ambition. If one has but a limited span, what is the point of aiming low? The awareness of mortality sharpened my desire to leave a significant mark, to achieve something truly vast and enduring. The idea of painting the map red, of a British Africa from Cape to Cairo, of establishing scholarships that would shape future generations, these were not the ambitions of a man who believed he had endless time for modest accomplishments. They were the ambitions of someone who felt compelled to make every moment count on a grand scale. Thirdly, yes, it certainly influenced my willingness to take monumental risks. When you are constantly aware that your personal time is a finite and possibly dwindling resource, the calculus of risk versus reward shifts. The potential loss in a bold venture might seem less daunting when weighed against the possibility of achieving a grand objective within that limited time frame. Delays, missed opportunities, these felt like greater threats than the potential failure of a daring plan. Whether it was staking my fortune on the diamond fields, challenging Kruger, or pushing for expansion against considerable odds, the underlying awareness of my own physical frailty often spurred me to act decisively and boldly, perhaps more so than if I had felt the luxury of decades stretching before me. It was not a morbid preoccupation, mind you, but it was a constant companion, a quiet insistence that, if I was to achieve the visions that burned within me, I could not afford to tarry. It lent a certain impatience to my character, a drive to see things through, to make them happen, because tomorrow was never guaranteed. The legacy I wished to build had to be constructed with all possible speed and determination, for I knew my own time to oversee it was likely to be shorter than I would have wished.
The Glenn Gray Act of 1894. Its labor tax provision effectively coerced Africans into wage labor. Many historians see this as a foundational piece of segregationist policy. What was your ethical calculus here? Did you genuinely believe this was civilizing, or was it primarily an economic mechanism to supply labor for your industries?
The Glenn Gray Act. Yes, that piece of legislation certainly provoked and continues to provoke considerable debate. Let me be clear about its intentions as I saw them and championed them. The Act had several components, including a shift towards individual land tenure for Africans in the designated districts rather than communal ownership, and the controversial labor tax, a tax levied on those adult males who could not demonstrate they had been in employment for a certain period of the year. My ethical calculus, as you put it, was rooted in a worldview prevalent in my time, and one I fervently subscribed to: the belief in the dignity of labor, and the idea that participation in the wage economy was a crucial step to what I and many of my contemporaries termed civilization. Did I genuinely believe it had a civilizing influence? Yes, in the context of my era, I did. The rationale was multifaceted. First, discouraging idleness. From my perspective, and that of many colonial administrators, traditional subsistence lifestyles, while functional within their own context, did not contribute to the broader economic development of the Cape Colony or integrate the African population into the modern cash-based economy we were building. The tax was intended as an incentive, or, if you prefer, a pressure to seek wage labor, which I believed would instill discipline, new skills, and an understanding of the wider economic world. Second, individual responsibility. The move towards individual land tenure, which was part of the Act, was also seen as civilizing. It aimed to break down what we considered to be less productive communal systems and encourage individual initiative and responsibility, mirroring European models of land ownership and agriculture. Third, contribution to the state. The underlying principle was also that every man should contribute to the state and the economy from which he, in theory, benefited. Now, was it primarily an economic mechanism to supply labor? There is no denying the powerful economic imperative. The mines, the farms, the burgeoning industries of the Cape all required a substantial and reliable labor force. The Glenn Gray Act, particularly its labor tax provision, was undeniably designed to increase the supply of that labor by creating a necessity for Africans to earn cash wages. To deny this economic driver would be disingenuous. So, my ethical calculus saw these two aspects, the civilizing mission and the economic necessity, as intertwined, even mutually supportive. By encouraging, or yes, coercing Africans into the wage labor system, I believed we were not only meeting the economic needs of the colony, but also guiding the African population to what I considered a more productive and advanced mode of existence. It was a paternalistic view, certainly, and one that assumed the superiority of our economic and social models. Many historians now view it as a foundational piece of segregationist policy, and I understand why. It aimed to control the movement and labor of the African population and to define their role within the colonial economy in a specific way. While the explicit systematized segregation of later decades was not the articulated intent of the Glenn Gray Act in 1894, the seeds of differential treatment and economic control were certainly there. My focus was on order, economic development as I understood it, and what I genuinely, if perhaps misguidedly from your modern perspective, saw as a path to civilizing the native peoples through work and individual land ownership. The economic needs of our industries were, without question, a significant factor in that calculation.
Your will established the Rhodes Scholarships, aiming to bring colonial, American, and German students to Oxford to foster global leadership. Yet the initial criteria, focusing on manly outdoor sports and qualities of manhood alongside academics, were quite specific. Were these criteria a direct reflection of your own perceived ideal, and did you ever consider that they might exclude other forms of valuable intellect or leadership?
You are correct. The criteria laid out in my will for the selection of Rhodes scholars were indeed specific and a direct reflection of what I considered to be the ideal qualities for future leaders who could make a significant impact on the world. Let me break down my thinking. Firstly, academic achievement. This was foundational. A sharp intellect and scholastic attainment were, of course, necessary. One cannot lead effectively without the ability to think critically and master complex subjects. Secondly, fondness of and success in manly outdoor sports such as cricket, football, and the like. This was not merely about athletic prowess for its own sake. I believed that participation and success in such sports cultivated essential qualities, namely, vigor and energy. Leaders need physical and mental stamina, teamwork and cooperation, the ability to work with others towards a common goal, discipline and resilience, the dedication required to train and the ability to face defeat and strive again, fair play and courage, important aspects of character. Thirdly, qualities of manhood, truth, courage, devotion to duty, sympathy for and protection of the weak, kindliness, unselfishness, and fellowship. This addressed the moral fiber of the individual. Intellect and physical ability alone are insufficient. A leader must possess strong moral character, integrity, and a sense of responsibility towards others. Fourthly, exhibition during school days of moral force of character and of instincts to lead and to take an interest in his schoolmates. This was about identifying demonstrated leadership potential from a young age. Individuals who naturally inspired and guided their peers, not for personal gain, but out of a genuine interest in their fellows. These criteria were designed to identify not just brilliant scholars, but well-rounded young men of exceptional character and proven leadership capacity. My vision was to bring such men to Oxford, where they would forge bonds of understanding and return to their own countries, be it the colonies, America, or Germany, to become leaders in public life, fostering peace and cooperation, and strengthening the ties within what I hoped would be a more unified English-speaking world, and with Germany as a partner. Now to your question. Did I ever consider that they might exclude other forms of valuable intellect or leadership? Frankly, my focus was on cultivating a particular type of leader, one who embodied the virtues and capabilities I believed were most effective for the grand public service I envisioned. My experiences in the rough and tumble of empire building, in politics and in business, convinced me that leadership required more than just cloistered academic brilliance. It required men of action, of robust character, and of physical presence. It is true that these criteria were very much a product of my time and my own values. Perhaps they did not explicitly make room for, say, the purely contemplative scholar, the artist whose leadership might be expressed through cultural influence, or the innovator whose genius lay in solitary scientific discovery rather than in leading teams on a sports field. My aim was specific: to find and nurture young men who would be doers and leaders in the public sphere, in the mold that I understood and valued. The selection was intended to find those with the highest potential to exert influence in political, administrative, and societal realms. While other forms of intellect and leadership are undoubtedly valuable to society, the Rhodes scholarships were specifically designed to cultivate a cohort of men who fit my particular vision of what was needed to guide the destinies of nations and promote international understanding according to the ideals I held. The criteria were a means to that specific end.
Beyond the grand Cape to Cairo vision, what's a smaller, almost forgotten project or idea you championed that you believe, if it had come to fruition, would have had a significant, positive, yet unheralded impact on Southern Africa?
That's a thoughtful question, prompting me to sift through ambitions of varying scales. Beyond the grand sweep of Cape to Cairo, which occupied so much of my vision and energy, there was a smaller, more localized project, or rather a persistent idea I championed that I believe could have yielded significant, though perhaps unheralded, positive impacts for Southern Africa. This was the systematic development of agricultural research and training focused on drought-resistant crops and water conservation techniques, specifically aimed at uplifting the farming communities, particularly the Boer farmers in the more arid and marginal lands of the Cape Colony and potentially beyond. While I invested heavily in fruit farming in the Western Cape through Rhodes Fruit Farms, demonstrating the commercial potential of intensive agriculture, my vision extended to the less fertile regions where many Afrikaner families struggled against harsh conditions. I believed that the application of scientific principles, the introduction of suitable drought-tolerant crops from other arid parts of the world, like certain types of sorghum or hardy wheats, and practical education in water-wise farming, small-scale irrigation, terracing, soil management, could transform these areas. I envisioned a network of small, practical agricultural experiment stations and training centers located within these challenging regions. These wouldn't be grand colleges, but hands-on places where local farmers could see new methods demonstrated, access improved seed stock, and learn techniques to make their land more productive and resilient to the frequent droughts that plagued so much of the interior. Why do I believe this would have had a significant, unheralded impact? First, economic stability. It could have significantly improved the livelihoods and food security of thousands of farming families, reducing their vulnerability and increasing the overall agricultural output of the colony in a sustainable way. Second, political conciliation. By directly addressing the economic struggles of many rural Afrikaners, it could have fostered greater loyalty to the Cape government and eased some of the underlying tensions that often characterized our relations. Prosperous farmers are generally more content. Third, resource management. It would have promoted a more sustainable use of land and water in regions prone to degradation, a long-term benefit that would have paid dividends for generations. And fourth, reduced reliance on imports. Stronger local agriculture in these regions would have made the entire colony less reliant on imported foodstuffs, especially during times of difficulty. This idea never came to fruition on the scale I had hoped. My energies and the colony's resources were so often consumed by the grander geopolitical schemes, the demands of the mining industry, and the push northwards. Funding and consistent focus for such a dispersed, less glamorous agricultural initiative were harder to secure and maintain. But had this network of practical research and training centers been robustly established and supported, I believe it would have quietly transformed the agricultural backbone of many parts of Southern Africa, making communities more prosperous and resilient, and fostering a more stable and self-sufficient society. It would have been a quieter revolution than a new Goldfield, but profound in its own way. It was an investment in the land and its people that I feel was never fully realized.
You once famously wept when you realized a part of the Bechuanaland Protectorate would remain under direct British rule, not your company's. What was the raw emotion behind those tears? Was it frustration, a sense of betrayal, or something deeper about your personal identification with the land?
Ah, that moment. Yes, the tears were genuine, and they were not shed lightly. You refer, I believe, to the settlement concerning Bechuanaland, where a significant portion, the Bechuanaland Protectorate, was to remain under direct imperial administration rather than being incorporated into the territories administered by my British South Africa Company. The raw emotion behind those tears was a potent cocktail, but it was not, as some might romantically imagine, a sentimental attachment to the soil itself in the way a farmer loves his ancestral fields. My connection to the land was one of potential, of strategic importance, of what it could become within the grand design. The dominant emotions were: 1. Profound frustration and impatience. I saw the imperial government, the imperial factor, as it was often called, as slow, cautious, often indecisive, and frequently hampered by political considerations in London that were far removed from the realities and opportunities in Africa. My company, I believed, was an instrument of swift, decisive action, capable of developing territories and securing British interests far more effectively and rapidly. To see a vital piece of the strategic puzzle like Bechuanaland, which was the Suez Canal to the interior, the key roadway to the north, kept out of the company's direct developmental control, felt like an unnecessary and debilitating constraint on our progress. It was a frustration born of a deep conviction that my way was faster and better for the Empire's ultimate aims. 2. A sense of thwarted vision. My ambition for a contiguous, economically integrated and British-dominated Southern and Central Africa was all-consuming. Every piece of territory had its place in this vast jigsaw. The decision regarding Bechuanaland felt like a direct impediment to this vision, a break in the chain I was forging. It complicated plans for railway lines, for administration, for the unified economic development I envisioned. The tears were for the damage, as I perceived it, to the integrity of that grand design. 3. Fear of inefficiency and missed opportunity. I genuinely believed that direct imperial rule, with its bureaucracy and what I often saw as a misguided or overly sentimental approach to native administration, which could hinder economic development, would be less effective in unlocking the potential of the territory compared to the focused, commercially driven approach of the company. I feared the territory would languish or that its development would be retarded, thus weakening the entire British position in the region. It was not a sense of personal betrayal in the emotional, interpersonal sense. It was the betrayal of a grand idea, of an optimal path as I saw it. It was the profound exasperation of a man who believed he knew how to achieve a monumental task, seeing obstacles placed in his way by those he felt should be his staunchest allies in that task. The tears were those of an architect seeing his blueprint arbitrarily altered by a committee, with the potential in his eyes to weaken the entire edifice. It was about the grand project, the mission, and the frustration of seeing it unnecessarily complicated and potentially compromised.
There's an account of you, when shown a map of Africa after the Jameson Raid, mournfully saying something akin to, "So much red, all for nothing now." Can you elaborate on a specific, less publicized strategic setback or a personal disappointment in your empire building that, at the time, felt like a truly crushing blow to your grand vision, even if you didn't show it publicly?
The Jameson Raid was, without doubt, a catastrophic miscalculation, a stain that reverberated through all my subsequent endeavors and severely damaged the trust so vital for my larger ambitions. The public ramifications were immense and are well documented. But if I were to point to a less publicized, yet deeply felt strategic setback, one that gnawed at me as a fundamental impediment to the grand vision, it would be the persistent failure to secure Delagoa Bay for British interests, and, by extension, for the economic and strategic integration of Southern Africa under a British framework. Delagoa Bay, with its magnificent natural harbour, modern-day Maputo, was the key maritime outlet for the Transvaal. From very early on, I recognized that control of this port was strategically vital. If the Transvaal, particularly after the gold discoveries, had its own independent, efficient access to the sea, free from British control, either Cape or Natal ports, then its economic and political independence would be vastly strengthened, making it much harder to bring it into a future British-South African Federation on terms favourable to the Empire. I made numerous attempts, directly and indirectly, through negotiation and financial inducement, to acquire Delagoa Bay from the Portuguese, or at least to ensure that Britain had preemptive rights or dominant influence over its railway and port facilities. Millions were potentially on the table. I saw it as an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle. The specific disappointment that often felt like a crushing blow was the outcome of the McMahon arbitration in 1875, which awarded Portugal full sovereignty over the southern shores of Delagoa Bay, despite British claims. While this predated the height of my power, its implications cast a long shadow. Later, in the 1880s and 1890s, repeated efforts to purchase it or to gain controlling concessions for the railway line from the Transvaal to the port were all ultimately thwarted. Kruger, of course, understood its importance just as well as I did, and he poured resources into the Delagoa Bay Railway to secure his republic's independent link to the outside world. Each time a negotiation failed or a scheme to gain influence there collapsed, it was a profound strategic setback. It wasn't a single dramatic event like the raid, but a slow, grinding frustration. Publicly, one maintained a determined front, but privately, the knowledge that this crucial gateway remained outside our firm control felt like a constant vulnerability in the grand structure I was attempting to build. It meant that the economic leverage we could exert over the Transvaal was diminished, and their capacity to resist incorporation into a British sphere was enhanced. It was less about red on the map being lost, as perhaps with Bechuanaland, and more about a vital artery for the future economic and political heart of the region remaining stubbornly out of reach. It was a failure that I knew would complicate, perhaps even endanger, the ultimate unification and British ascendancy that I so fervently pursued. This wasn't a public scandal, but a persistent, aching strategic wound.
Mr. Rhodes, our allotted time for this initial, and I must say, quite extraordinary conversation is drawing to a close. You've offered us a compelling and at times deeply challenging window into your life and the era you so profoundly shaped. There are, of course, so many more facets of your ambitions, your methods, and your intricate legacy that we've only begun to touch upon. The complexities are vast. Therefore, Mr. Rhodes, we would be deeply honored if you would consider returning for a follow-up interview to allow us to delve even further, perhaps into some of the more contentious and less understood aspects we've alluded to.
Indeed. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Your perspectives have been profoundly thought-provoking, and I personally would welcome the chance to explore the human undercurrents more deeply.
Absolutely. A fascinating initial exploration. I eagerly anticipate the opportunity to further dissect the philosophical and ethical frameworks behind your monumental endeavors. Thank you, sir.
Your willingness to engage with these critical questions is noted, Mr. Rhodes. A further session to rigorously examine the details would be most illuminating. Thank you.
So, from all of us here at Echoes of the Past Interviews, Mr. Rhodes, our sincere gratitude for this enlightening first dialogue. and we eagerly await your thoughts on a continuation.
Yes, an engaging forum, I will concede, Miss Moreau. Your panel asks questions that demand consideration. I find the prospect of further clarification agreeable. There is always more to discuss when one has lived a life of consequence. You may expect me.
Excellent. We are most grateful, Mr. Rhodes, and look forward to it immensely. Thank you once again. And thank you to our audience for joining us on Echoes of the Past interviews. We trust this first encounter with Mr. Cecil John Rhodes has sparked as much thought for you as it has for us. Be sure to join us for our next episode, where we will continue our dialogue with Mr. Rhodes, promising an even deeper dive into the life of this complex historical figure. Until then,
Keep questioning the echoes.